Welcome everyone. My name is Jeanette Jackson. I'm the CEO of Foresight. Very excited today to launch the Cleantech Forward series. So if you've been following along the last several months, we were really focused on COVID-19 emergency support, whether it was funding, investor engagement, etc. And now we're coming up for some air and looking at moving forward. So now that we are coming out of the health crisis, in particular in BC, at least at this time, the numbers are looking quite promising. I think it's really time that we start to dive into how we're going to restart and reignite the economy with clean tech and a green economy top of mind. And so the Cleantech Forward series is meant to start to have these conversations and these dialogues at both a macro level and then of course a micro level into lots of different details. So look out for upcoming announcements on that. Today, we're going to take a little bit of a different approach. I'm actually going to be passing this over to my colleague Stephen to run the session today, but a few welcome notes, a session overview, and then he'll take over and introduce the speakers and get into a great series of presentations and conversations. In terms of housekeeping notes, upcoming webinar, we do next week have a Scaling Cleantech webinar, which I think it's a great opportunity to dive in and talk about sort of the gaps that we have in scaling cleantech, as well as some different mechanisms that are available, not only traditional mechanisms, but perhaps some forward-looking ideas that we have, both provincial and federally, to help us figure out how we're going to scale all the great cleantech, both from a project and company perspective. And then in the next weeks after that, we're moving into a future economy series. So they'll be sort of complementary to one another, but the future economy series is really about addressing gaps and opportunities and priorities in various sub-clean tech sectors. So you'll see the list here: built environment, mining, agri-food, energy. This isn't about us creating new roadmaps. It's about looking at what roadmaps are available, as well as the technology competencies that we see, and trying to sort of do some matchmaking around that. So you can check out all of this on our website to register. And then if you are a cleantech SME on today, I know usually we get quite a broad spectrum of stakeholders, whether it's investors and government partners and the like. If you are a cleantech SME and or know any cleantech SMEs across Canada that would like to be part of the Restart and Resiliency program, we will be doing a formal email out to everyone in the next week or so on what that program is going to look like. But some really great things are coming together to cover things including grant writing, supply chain management, and of course that is always accompanied by direct EIR support with our 40+ cleantech executives and residents. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Stephen to introduce the topic, Future of Environmental Markets, How to Win as a Clean Tech Company, and hope you enjoy the session, and we'll talk to everyone soon.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jeanette. Can everyone see my screen there?
Yep.
Awesome. So a little bit of background, actually, why I thought this would be really valuable as something to talk about as Foresight. It was one of our executives and residents, Jeff Reading, as we were talking to a number of our companies, we kept asking them what they knew about it, whether they felt it applied to their business model, and the answers weren't really crisp and clear, and there wasn't a lot of comprehension in among our SMEs of what they could do, how they could take advantage of this, or talk intelligently to have looked at the topic. So that's where I started to dive into it, and I realized it was a lot more complex than simply, what can I currently sell it for? What's today's price? It's not a barrel of oil, but there's a lot more going on to it than that. And so that's why I put together a panel of people that I think represent some of the viewpoints and things that we need to know. So today we're going to kind of cover the international and domestic background of what's available out there in terms of environmental attributes and how you can monetize those. What some of the things we'll be looking forward to see on the international stage coming up, and then some of the picadillos or points about the contracts that we should look for, and as well also in the contract execution, things to look for in terms of protocols and how to actually get projects ready to monetize. So with that, we have our 3 speakers. The first one I'm going to introduce is Kai Alderson. He'll be the first to speak. He comes from Fasken. He's a lawyer by training. And so he works and executes a lot of their contracts in this space. So again, with trading these, he'll go into a little bit more detail about why it's a special product and why special consideration is required when you're drawing up the legal contract. It's not as simple as a can of Coke that you can buy and sell and know what you have in your hand. There's a lot more to it than that. Katie Sullivan from the International Emissions Trading Association. She's got a great view of what's happening in the global space on this, and their goal, as you might guess, is to bring about international trading of these credits. She's had a long career in the space, worked at various organizations and different bodies trying to bring about the international trading in an efficient way. And finally, Simon Phillips from NatureBank. Simon brings that his engineer training and his logical mind to the execution of projects. And if you're not familiar with NatureBank, I was more familiar with their kind of customer-facing side, which is offsetters. So they've been involved in carbon credits and trading for many years. And so NatureBank is the organization that can execute projects, give advice, and manage the verification process. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kai.
If I can manage my unmute button, I am good to go. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thanks to all the participants. I'm really excited to have a chance to talk to all of you about what I think of as a very exciting area of law, the practice of law. I work in the energy and natural resources group at Fasken Martineau. I am a partner there. And I've been working in the carbon space for essentially my entire professional career at Fasken. It goes back a ways. And my job in the kickoff segment, I'll be talking in more detail later about the legal aspects, but I wanted to give some background in the history and sort of philosophy behind environmental markets in order to ground the conversation that will follow. So if we could just advance to the next slide, Stephen. So just a bit of history, and this is not my concept. I'm stealing this from Saul Griffith, a US energy analyst and Cleantech pioneer, but he points out the last time that we had the kind of broad industrial transformation of a scale that we need today to address climate change really was the growth of the personal automobile. And when we think of that revolution, that industrial transformation that brought in the era of personal powered transportation, we remember the Model T. We remember the very technical work that Henry Ford did to use existing technologies, bring them together, and develop a way to make cars cheaply and widely available. And while that was definitely a necessary ingredient, it wasn't a sufficient one. And in fact, there was very slow uptake in auto sales at the beginning. It wasn't until several years later that General Motors invented the personal car loan that we actually got massive uptake of automobile sales. And that's an important lesson for us in the clean tech sector who are envisioning a future that includes transformative industry-wide uptake of the technologies that you're all working on, because we need not only the technological change, but the legal and the financial innovation that will allow for mass uptake of new technologies. So if we could advance the slide, our sort of premise of this conversation we're having today is that environmental markets are exactly that kind of legal and financial innovation that will allow for transformative change. And these come back to the 90s when there was an acid rain problem. Many of you will be familiar with this history, where particular emissions from coal-fired power plants in the US was causing problems in the US and Canada. And they developed a new regulatory scheme that involved setting caps and providing tradable permits that allowed for companies who had lower costs of compliance to benefit, to be incentivized to overperform. And it was massively successful. If we could just advance the slide, you'll see there was massive reduction in emissions related to the markets in sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. And so don't want to get into the details of that, but this is just the great historical example where it really did work. And the essence, the core of environmental markets is the idea that you can incentivize overperformance by some actors in the economy as a way of reaching an aggregate target and allow for flexible compliance by some other actors in the economy. And then the environmental markets comes in with a kind of some kind of trade or tradable permit or allowance. If we could advance the slide next. Now in the carbon markets, this model, which allows for reductions in the overall cost of achieving the same level of aggregate compliance, is really in the carbon space is broken apart between compliance markets. If we could just advance the slide, where there are a number of different compliance markets, some of which, such as the RGGI, the RGGI that's listed at the top, are very, very similar to the old acid rain markets that we talked about before, the SOx and NOx markets, where there are particular emissions permissions that are auctioned off and allocated and then traded amongst electricity producers. But in the carbon market, there's also been a large expansion of other actors who could get involved, because many areas where carbon can be reduced are not the regulated areas, the regulated entities like electricity production, but may be enhancements to forestry or different approaches to reducing greenhouse gases in other areas which are not regulated. That's the source of the offset, carbon offset part of the market, which has been incredibly important and is a feature of the Quebec and California and BC markets. But all of them are related to offsets as a means of achieving a compliance obligation imposed by government. At the same time, the carbon markets took a long time to get up and running, and so there emerged an entire voluntary sector of the market where companies that sought net neutral or reduction targets for their own business reasons were looking for ways of showing that they were reducing their environmental impacts. So there's an entire realm of voluntary offset trading, which is a really exciting part of the market. And in addition, there's been a proliferation of other markets. We could just advance the slide, where the same concept of incentivizing overperformance by some actors in a way that will get reflected in the performance of others and reach an aggregate target has been used both in low carbon fuel and renewable energy. And there's a whole host of markets that we'll touch on in the course. So that was just trying to provide you with some history, little few touch points, and then we're going to talk more about the general market as it occurs now and circle back to some of the more detailed issues as we go.
Thanks, Kai. I'm going to hand it over to Katie Sullivan to paint the picture of what's kind of happening on the global stage and introduce some of those themes. Katie?
Thanks very much, Stephen and Jeanette and Foresight. It's actually been quite a pleasure to work with you and your community over the last couple of weeks. And I look forward to future collaboration, hopefully, with you and the Cleantech ecosystem within your orbit over the coming weeks and months. I was very excited to actually see the summary of the great webinars that you have coming up. And obviously, I couldn't help but think that there are some, whether it's on the agriculture side or the forestry side or the mining side, where you could have some dots connecting with this environmental market space that we're talking about here today. So next slide, please. So this, first of all, shout out to Kai for a great overview on the history of these environmental markets, right? And also just to clearly illustrate at the front end, those differences in the buckets between compliance and the voluntary markets, right? And some of those key players, be it the governments on the compliance side or these key standards like CAR, ACR, Vera on the voluntary side. And that actually is, you know, nice when you took a snapshot of, this is not even up to date. We actually need a more recent slide, but these are all the members that I represent and AIDA represents across really that value chain of environmental markets, being, you know, bigger buyers. These are large emitters, power, manufacturing, industrials, right? Those that are facing compliance obligations or know the inevitability that compliance is coming, right, around these environmental markets. But also we represent a lot of clean project developers, assurance providers, lawyers, and also, I mean, I say the standards, so like CAR and ACR Vera, we represent them as well, right? So I just like to drive home the fact that we really are that true multi-sector voice, that collective business voice on these markets all around the world, which you'll see in a moment how busy things are these days at all levels across all borders. Next slide, please, Stephen. So if we take a 50,000 foot level of the Paris Agreement, right, 2015, it's gavelled through, and everything is good in the world those days. And even back then, when you look at the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, by the 190 plus countries that have, you know, signed, now ratified the Paris Agreement, you see over 100 of these countries, even again back in 2015, that identified that they will use markets, meaning international cooperation, international carbon markets, trading across borders, right? Or that they could and would like to use these markets, should these markets materialize. And, you know, for reasons of, they want access, for instance, in the Canadian context, certainly they want access to lower cost options to reach their climate targets, their NDCs, and or they're looking for financing, to drive financing in their borders to reach their climate targets. And they're willing to, you know, forsake some of the reductions within their borders to trade it outside of their borders for other, you know, countries or companies within countries to reach their climate targets. Now, so that's all the green, right? The green hatched and the green solid, the countries that plan to or would like to use markets. Now, if we were to update this slide, we did this back with EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, in 2015-16. If we were to update this map today, there would be even more green, a lot more solid green and even hatched green across this map. Next slide, please, Stephen. So we know that even, you know, before Paris was a thing or even discussed through 2015, there were lots of carbon pricing programs that were under development and in existence, right? The European Emissions Trading System, RGGI, as Kai mentioned, that's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in Northeast US. You had California, Quebec, cap and trade systems. You had Alberta. That's an oldie. It's been around since 2007. And those are the trading systems. There's also the carbon taxes, flat carbon taxes, but there's also hybrid programs, right? So there's pure cap and trade. There is a pure tax, no flexibility or trading. Then you have like the federal Canadian output-based pricing standard, performance standard trading systems. You also have hybrid like tax programs where you can use trading, offset components in order to reach compliance obligations. We see that in Colombia and South Africa right now. So the takeaway here is that, you know, this is the World Bank Carbon Pricing State and Trends map. It was just released about a month ago. This is what we consider the, you know, the gospel resource that comes out every year. And every year this map becomes busier and busier, right? But it's also, not only do you have now over, I think, 65 carbon pricing programs of all shades that are under development or in existence, over 30 of them are carbon market emissions trading systems. And so that is the next slide, please, Stephen. This is AIDA's more frenetic map that only highlights the carbon markets. Now, the compliance carbon markets that are in existence or under development. And it actually doesn't even capture all of them, but what what I just want to drive home here is that it is happening everywhere. It's happening quite quickly. IETA just today released our Global Carbon Market Survey report. We do this annually with PwC that actually takes stock of some highlights from a market participant, a business perspective, around where we're seeing, prices today, where prices could head. There's a lot of discussion around Asia Pacific, right? Korea, China, obviously. You have Australia, even New Zealand, that there's a lot of innovation happening across their trading systems. Latin America, there's a lot of action happening in Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru. That's the Pacific Alliance traditional trading bloc that have actually committed to together working to align and harmonize their carbon pricing programs. And then obviously, North America, and we'll dig more into the Canadian fragmentation nation, I call it, with carbon markets. But even again in the US, you have California, Northeast US, and even you see little blips around Oregon, Washington State about who might be moving ahead next on trading. Corsia, this logo at the very bottom below Africa, that's the airlines, the aviation, international aviation carbon market that is happening right now. Everybody's watching, and it's the first sectoral program of its kind to address aviation emissions. And it's an offsetting program. So airlines will be expected to purchase eligible offset credits in order to meet their obligations under Corsia. So next slide, please. All right, so I have a list of, and again, a shout out to the World Bank that captured all the different project types. And we talk about offset credits, right? There's a whole bunch of these project types, where you could see quantification methodology and a protocol, and ultimately the issuance of these credits, be it voluntary or compliance, that are around, right? And there are hundreds of methodologies available out there right now, and dozens of different project types or categories. So here's some of the bigger buckets, just so again your audience is familiar with them. And Stephen had asked if there were some, I won't go like every single one of them, but some kind of nuggets or highlights I could tease out for each of them, just so to have a bit of a, I guess, clear practical understanding around where things are currently in use. So agriculture, activities associated with ag on farm management, right? Including livestock activity, methane reduction. Agriculture, a lot of eyes are on agriculture, including forestry. So sorry, agriculture, forestry. This would be the bucket of natural climate solutions or native solutions. Agriculture, you see a lot of leadership innovations happen with protocols, carbon markets in ag, in Alberta. You are also seeing agriculture as a priority project type under the new federal offsets program that's currently under development. Carbon capture storage, or carbon capture utilization and storage. This is, I know for the Foresight community, there's a lot of interest in CCS, CCUS. You haven't seen a lot of protocols currently under development for CCUS, but it's going to be more and more interest. What? I lost it on my end. Okay. So you're going to see more interest in not just across the carbon market space, but also around the low carbon markets, carbon fuel standards, the Canadian fuel standards. So there are protocols that are being developed or in existence of CCUS in these markets. We'll talk a bit later about some of the differences between carbon market, LCFS, and the interactions there. But I will say at Alberta, shout out to Alberta, compliant CCS and EOR protocols do exist. And again, in the international Kyoto Day space, there is a lot of work that's gone into quantification methodology for CCS under the Clean Development Mechanism. Energy efficiency opportunities, you'll see that across the gamut of voluntary standards, international markets. One thing to keep in mind with energy efficiency projects or protocols, if you have these cap and trade systems or compliance carbon pricing systems that are full coverage, it's unlikely that you're going to see renewables and energy efficiency opportunities available in these carbon market areas. So again, it's something to keep in mind when looking at where the puck's headed, where the opportunities lie. Forestry, I'll just drive home. This really captures the whole gamut. afforestation, reforestation, improved forestry management, IFM, reduced emissions from deforestation, loads of opportunity here in Canada, loads of experience already in Canada with protocols, including in British Columbia, a priority area for the federal carbon market offset program under development. And Alberta, we expect that forest protocol development to get underway soon. Fuel switching, that in BC is the only updated protocol that you see. We're expecting more BC protocols to develop, but the fuel switching one has been done, that is available. And it really is quite a model for a lot of other programs. Kai and Simon will know a lot more about that and might be able to chime in. Fugitives, very quickly, this is when you're talking about methane avoidance. And you know, this is the leaks, the vents, loads of tech, including SME innovation happening in this area. Alberta is a leader in, especially where you see pneumatics come on board because of the protocol, that carbon market revenue. So watch this space on fugitive emissions too, not just in Canada, but globally. Next slide, please. And this just captures a few other project types. I won't go by line here, but just so you're aware of the methodologies, protocols already in development or that could in these different areas. The only things that I will tease out, the other lands. So you have forestry, you have ag, and then there's this other lands with wetlands, peat. Again, a lot of attention will be paid to this area, including technology service providers that can lend some services, technologies to support quantification, monitoring, reporting, verification in this space. Next slide, please, Stephen. And then very quickly, just the Canadian snapshot. So this is what I said earlier. There's a bit of a fragmentation nation in Canada. But we are doing a better job in defragmenting the country with many thanks to really the federal government and its work with the PCF, the Pan-Canadian Framework, and its carbon pricing legislation and its benchmark approach. So really the takeaway here is that you have some provinces, including BC and Quebec and Nova Scotia, that are purely provincially administered. And they have their own carbon prices right now, be it $40 a ton in British Columbia. In Quebec, it's where the market heads, right? So right now, 23 bucks a ton, the floor price. Nova Scotia, you have $20 a ton floor price. The oranges, the block oranges, this is the pure federal carbon price backstop. So they're takers of that pricing program. So that's $30 a ton in 2020, goes up by $10, 2021 to 40, and then 2022, $50. And then we don't know what will happen after 2022, so watch that space. Alberta and Saskatchewan, just a quick highlight that these are hybrid programs. So when I say that Alberta has, you know, a market, it's a provincially administered market. It's gone through a lot of different permutations in the years, but you have Alberta's large emitter market, provincially administered, currently $30 a ton, getting loads of learnings, protocols there, and quite a surge of activity and sophistication in Alberta. Just the next slide, and I think it's more just so your audience is aware that this is available as a takeaway. Here's just forecasts going forward. Everybody cares about pricing forecasts, right? So if you're going to be investing in a project opportunity protocol development, well, what's the price today? But what you care about is what could the price be in 2025, 2030. So here's just some forecasts of the pricing in Canada right now. And a shout out to Clear Blue Markets, one of our members at IETA that does some really top-notch pricing forecasts across Canada. So I asked with permission to use some of their forecast snapshot here today. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Stephen. Thank you. You're on mute. You're on mute. You're still on mute.
Now you should be able to hear me. What I was going to say was we'll be sharing the webinar with everybody afterwards, the recording. Should you want the slides to look at them individually, you can also request those. So the contact information, if you do have more questions afterwards, will be available to you. With that, I'll turn it over to Simon. So we've talked about kind of the global, what are the drivers for it? What is it looking like on the international stage? And now we'll look at a little bit what a project would look like. Simon?
Thanks, Stephen. First off, thanks to Foresight, Stephen and Jeanette, for the invitation to speak. I think both Kai and Katie provided an excellent introduction and overview And probably the understanding of people who are not too familiar in the space is in a better position already. I think I always get something from hearing Katie speak, because it is such a dynamic space, and it's really important to have an organization like IEDA that's providing that kind of high level perspective on what's happening globally, because it's pretty heterogeneous space, and it's important to kind of keep abreast of the constant change. Obviously, as Katie mentioned, it's a progress. So it's always positive to see these maps. So I'm with NatureBank. NatureBank and Offsetters, our subsidiary company, have been in the climate advisory and carbon project development space for over a decade now. Offsetters started, I think, in 2007. If we go to the next slide, Stephen. So I lead the clean technology and industrial innovation team at NatureBank, and we work with clean technology startups and companies, and also companies that are advancing clean technology projects. And we've seen, a wide range of sectors and also technology readiness. So we have a good perspective on kind of the world of projects, what's required, and sort of just a good line of sight to many different particular activities and how they can play in the environmental market space. If we go to the next slide. So there's really three kind of key takeaways I'd like the audience to get from my presentation. First is to recognize the value in doing environmental benefits assessments and doing it as early as possible. The next is to provide an overview of the carbon credits available. I think both Kai and Katie have done a great job there, so I won't spend too much time there, other than maybe to provide some perspective on a few of the credit types. And then lastly, I'd like to kind of get the audience to really get an understanding as to what it looks like getting into the weeds of project development, particularly with respect to offset project development, because that's the greatest body of knowledge, and some good key learnings can be taken from there. I mean, this is a information dense. One could spend hours speaking on each of these topics. So really the takeaways is going to be, just getting the flavor of this space. If we go to the next slide, please. So, obviously the clean tech audience here, clearly environmental benefits are central to the value prop. What I want to do is just underscore the value in really making that assessment early on in your development and making that a quantitative assessment. That puts you in a good position to understand what the opportunities are out there for you potentially. If we go to the next slide, really what is environmental benefits quantification? Put simply, it's taking a look at your technology, be it a product, a process, or service, looking at the impacts of that technology and assessing it against a baseline or potentially a series of baselines. And so what you're getting is a delta. You're getting, your impact compared to the baseline impact, and that is providing your benefit. And typically you're doing a life cycle approach. So you're not only looking at your on-site project specific emissions, you also need to take the full life cycle. So you need to look at upstream and downstream emissions. So you're really getting the full picture. So any claims that can be asserted are really representative of what the true benefits are, rather than just cherry picking a particular point in the value chain. The good news is that life cycle approach is harmonized with many of the crediting systems, if not all of the crediting systems approaches. So for example, an offset system via its protocols, which are the backbone of credit realization, those are taking a life cycle approach in the development of the protocols. Similar, like a low carbon fuel standard crediting system, the carbon intensity targets are taken from a life cycle approach, so a wells to wheel approach. So by doing that quantification process, you're already harmonizing yourself to potentially what you'd be looking at when you're developing a project under a crediting system. If we go to the next slide, please. So really an outcome of the environmental benefits assessment, on one side of it, you have, some hard data, some information that can be utilized on a communications or marketing front to show the value to potential purchasers. Moving along the spectrum, you have, required information that a third party stakeholders would be needing. So if that's venture capital who are part of their due diligence want to understand really what the benefits would be, or if it's a funding entity like a Sustainable Development Technology Canada, who are making it a requisite part of their funding is to have that benefits quantification done. And then finally, on the other side, the ideal outcome often is the true monetization of these benefits through realizing tradable assets, so environmental assets. So if we go to the next slide. So Kai did a great job in presenting the lay of the land in terms of what's out there in terms of asset types. There's obviously similar spaces one can pursue for any particular project or activity type rather. So for example, if one had a clean technology company, one could potentially be pursuing either an offset or a low carbon fuel standard credit, or potentially both. There's important differences there in terms of what project realization looks like. Right now the low carbon fuel standard space is attractive insofar as there's a real price premium there compared to offsets. You're looking at order of magnitude value, so that's particularly attractive. The offset space is a very big space, and it's got a lot of history there. So there's a lot of information and understanding there. If we go to the next slide, maybe just focusing on offsets, that you have the voluntary versus compliance distinction that Kai made. It's worth considering a few things about those two spaces. The compliance versus the voluntary, there's often a price premium there. Whereas if you're a project proponent and you're developing a voluntary offset project, you typically have a bigger market size to play, and you're not beholden to a particular region. So there's a greater potential from that perspective. Now, both compliance and voluntary offsets are commodities insofar as the unit is a ton of carbon dioxide equivalents, emission reduction or removal. So in that sense, they're both commodities. Now, when you're getting into the voluntary space, they do take on some product attributes insofar as the provenance, or really the project characteristics are often of interest to potential purchasers. And it's not just the ton itself that is the unit of main interest. There can be what is often referred to as the charisma of the project. Really, what are the co-benefits? So it's not just the pure commodity play there. There is often some other elements that are integrated into the offset project development that become attractive to the purchasing side. So if you're a clean technology company, often there's a potential to leverage your technology and the projects that it's driving to attract potential purchasers. So that's an important consideration in the voluntary space. Now, there's a big net zero ambition right now in the voluntary space. The population of purchasers have certain preferences. Sequestration seems to be an attractive one. So there's a lot going on there in the voluntary space, but those are some considerations that one could take away from this. If we go to the next slide, please. So focusing now on the offset project development process, it would be good, I feel, to provide a bit of granularity into what that looks like. The good news is, it's a relatively established space. I mean, it's both old and new at the same time. It's new in the grand arc of environmental policy. Environmental markets are relatively new, but at the same time, offset systems have been around for at least a couple decades. So there's a good body of knowledge there. There's well-established best practices. You don't have to reinvent the wheel when you're developing these things. There's some differentiation. Some offset systems are more streamlined than others, but generally speaking, you're looking at the same process. So if we go to the next slide, this is, when looking across offset systems, this is, the common project development process. You have two distinct phases. You have the design phase and you have the implementation phase. Now, if you're doing, that benefits quantification, one would put that into the feasibility phase, as an external project developer or an advisor. That phase is often the most interesting or intellectually stimulating insofar as you see a wide cross section of potential project proponents, it can be a little bit depressing sometimes because you're breaking the bad news that, oh, you actually don't have a project here. But when you do, it's very exciting. And so other things with feasibility, you would be looking at obviously cost, which markets one could potentially pursue. So the outcome of that process is going into the next stage, is where you're summarizing it and condensing it into a project information document or a project information note. Or if you're in some systems that don't have that formal step, basically what that is providing a concise summary to a gatekeeper or the arbiter of that the purchasing interest. So you're providing that concise information to see if there's really a go or no go decision to further pursue the design and development of that project. So in a regulatory system, that could be a representative arm of the government, or it could be maybe in a voluntary system, a direct purchaser interest. But if there's a green light there, then you go into the most kind of resource intensive phase, and that's the drafting of the project design document or the project plan, which is a formal forward-looking document that basically provides all information required to be able to show how you'll be quantifying the project, the monitoring plan you have in place, how it meets the eligibility requirements for that offset system, and the protocol, which is a key document required in all offset development. I'll talk more on that later. So the project plan or project design document has all of this forward-looking and descriptive information, which very often gets third-party audited in a validation phase. Some systems, offset systems, this is optional, but many, there's a third-party audit required to ensure that basically the project plan is meeting the requirements of the system and the protocol. So once you have that project plan established and validated, then it's registered and you are off to the races in terms of your implementation phase. So the implementation phase is dictated by the project lifetime or crediting period. It can be 8 years, 10 years, let's say, or it can be longer if it's, let's say, a forestry type project that can be longer. And the implementation phase is comprised of a number of cycles of monitoring your implemented activity, and then reporting it. So as prescribed by your project plan, doing the quantification and reporting it. And then that gets third-party audited again, it gets verified. And once the verifier is issued their report, then it gets issued. And then the tons are realized. And that will be done a number of times per your project plan. Let's say it could be annually, you have 10 vintages in a 10-year cycle. So that's generally the arc of project development. Now, going back to the project design document, like I said, the protocol is key here, because it is what really makes the market for you as project proponent. One must have a protocol in place. There must be a protocol established for your project activity in order for you to realize emission reductions. And so if we go to the next slide. So if there isn't one, one has to develop one. So the first thing one would do, in the feasibility is, okay, this is your activity. Is there a protocol? And if there is, that's great. You want to just make sure that your project activity is aligned with what's dictated by that protocol. But if there isn't, then there's nothing stopping you in most systems to developing a protocol. Now, in compliance systems, there's often a greater barrier to entry because that protocol process is often under the auspices or directly driven by the regulator. So it becomes a much more stakeholder intensive and resource intensive process. But the project proponent can take direct kind of control or initiative to develop those protocols. So under, let's say, a VCS system, one can develop a protocol and bring it to VCS, and it would be getting verified, etc., or validated rather. So if we go to the next slide. So yeah, protocols ensure that these offsets are real, permanent, quantifiable, and verifiable. It's important that as a project proponent and you're interested in developing one, that the development team at its minimum has the greenhouse gas quantification experience plus the probably internal technological expertise. And it can be a time-consuming process. So in a voluntary system, if there are similar protocols, but not one specific to your activity, you could be looking at probably less than a year. It's very streamlined. But if you're in a compliance regime and you're supporting the development of protocol, it can be much longer. If we go to the next slide, please. So this slide is basically to provide a snapshot of some considerations one would have as a project developer in the feasibility stage, let's say. So ownership is key, and Kai, I'm sure we'll be touching on this after. Any project proponent needs to show that they have a legal claim to the environmental attributes of that project. So if, as a clean technology company, you're looking at a licensing model, then that ownership is likely not present. One can certainly do a benefits quantification in order to support a value add to potential purchasers, but direct ownership, one must have direct ownership of the emission reduction in order to claim the offsets. Market rollout, what does your company's rollout look like? What's the ramp up period? What markets are you in? What regions are you in? That's going to dictate, really what offset systems one can pursue. Activity eligibility, like I said, is there a protocol in place? And if not, what does it look like to either modify an existing one or develop a new one? The cost benefit is probably the most intuitive. What is the value of the environmental attribute versus what are the project development costs? What is the hurdle to overcome, which ties into the additionality piece. Now, additionality is a key fundamental component of an offset project, and it basically, additionality is the notion that without those offsets, the project wouldn't happen. So the offsets are what enable the project to happen. So without the offsets, you would have a business as usual situation, which would not be the project condition. Now, in terms of additionality, what I will say there is one should really look at the offset system and which one is engaging. Because traditionally, in the infancy of offsets, it was really, the financial barrier was key. Looking at the cost of the price of the environmental attribute and the hurdle that must be overcome from a financial perspective. And there has been an evolution insofar as, there are other methods to be utilized potentially in order to demonstrate additionality. So in some systems, the protocols themselves might include a positive list of activities, for example. So the additionality piece has been included in the protocol development. So really, it's if you have that activity, automatically it's deemed additional. Another common approach we're seeing is, looking at market penetration. So really, for your project activity, what is the market for it? What's the total market adoption potential? Where are you? Is the project activity very early on? Is it an early adopter in the innovation curve? Obviously, to its extreme, the first of its kind project would be, one type of additionality case. And so, the takeaway there is that there's a number of approaches that one can take to address that. And then the latter two, the project boundary and leakage, those are really in the quantification. Again, project boundary, one needs to take a look at not only the on-site, but potentially any upstream or downstream emissions that would be relevant. And questions like, does one have control or can they be monitored? The leakage question is basically to ensure, that any claims that are made for emission reductions aren't discounting or not considering associated emissions increases as a result of the project activity. So let's say you're doing a fuel switch and you're switching to biomass, and by procuring that biomass in a supply limited market, you might be realizing external entities from having a limited supply of that biomass, so they're actually switching activities. So that's one form of activity leakage. temporal leakage would be, let's say, for example, if you have a carbon capture and utilization project, and you're making claims around, the permanent storage of that carbon that you've sequestered, that you've captured, is the project, or is the product you are making something that has a life cycle of a year versus something that has a life cycle of 100 years. So, for example, something that's in the built environment, that would be a consideration that you would have to have baked into your project quantification. So these things give you a flavor of really, key considerations that one should have. You could go on at great length with any one of these. I mean, the real takeaway is that, while there are, protocols in place for many project activities, and if you're a clean technology company that has a direct line of sight to one of these protocols, it's very important to really think about your, project specific considerations, because often that, the devil is often in the details. So it's important to really, get, third-party advice early on, do your benefits quantification. And I think I'll probably leave it at that. If we go to the next slide, I think that's the last slide. Yes. So I'll pass it back. I think it's going to Kai now.
Yeah, we're returning to coming back where we started from.
Perfect.
Thank you, Simon. I think that's a wonderful description of the mechanics of doing some of the things and some of the things to look at. And certainly, I've got some more questions for you afterwards if we have time. So I'll jump into Kai, and to all the people watching, if you do have any questions, there's the Q&A option, so you can list them there, and we will address those afterwards after Kai is up next. We'll finish speaking.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Stephen. So maybe just taking a step back, there's obviously a lot of information in this presentation, and I do want to say that I've kept the details fairly light over the next few slides. And so I just want to say, and I'm sure Simon and Katie would say the same thing, that if anyone has any questions that aren't addressed in the course of the question and answer, I am more than happy to take a call. My contact details are in the presentation, because with carbon markets especially, and other environmental commodities as well, it is actually a very limited space of the number of lawyers, for example, who have the kind of experience in both the environmental policy and just commercial transactions to be able to give really, really targeted advice. And so I'm going to be talking in my presentation a lot about some of the challenges of doing transactions in the environmental market space. But I want to emphasize that I'm only raising the challenges because we have solutions to them. And it would take a very long time to go through all of the solutions, but really looking forward to talking during the question and answer period and afterwards with anyone who wants to talk. So even if you are feeling a little overwhelmed, sometimes just a 5-minute call with someone who knows what they're talking about can set everything straight. So I wanted to start my little section on environmental markets, the legal aspects of environmental markets, by making the following point, which is that we talk about compliance markets and we talk about voluntary markets, and that would sound as if there's a sharp distinction. You think lawyer, you think law, that's got to be in the compliance markets, and that's certainly true. But we're also very involved in the voluntary sector, because we're helping with transactions, just any ordinary aspect of the purchase and sale of offsets that are in the voluntary sector, and in the development of offset projects. Because both the voluntary and the compliance sector are highly rule-based. And they're rule-based in a way, what has evolved over time are these fundamental underlying principles. And I thought it would be a good way to start the legal aspect by talking about these underlying principles, because these aren't written down in the law. Well, sometimes they're referred to in the laws, but you're not going to be able to point to a piece of legislation that talks about. These have just emerged as part of the practical history of carbon and other environmental markets. And if you understand these, principles, you can kind of get at 80% of the legal questions that come up, or the questions that come up. So I just wanted to start here and then go into a little more detail. First is around additionality. Simon talked about additionality from the perspective, the very important perspective of what the actual protocols require. But it's also just something to remember as an underlying principle for the credibility of an environmental market. So basically what additionality is trying to capture is the idea that the project that you're investing in, or the project that you're conducting, makes a difference. It's a difference that makes a difference in the world. And let's say you're a coal-powered, just as an example, and I'm taking an egregious example that wouldn't actually come up in the carbon markets, but you're a coal-powered plant that's about to go bankrupt and you're just on the verge of shutting down, and then you do shut down. Well, you can't claim carbon credits for that. Now that's a bad example, but the point being, the investments in environmental market projects have to make a difference in the world. And if you remember that kind of causal sense of additionality, you can solve a lot of legal issues. And so it arises in the protocols almost as an accounting question, but that accounting issue, the carbon accounting issue as it shows up in protocols, is reflecting this fundamental interest that all parties in the carbon and other environmental markets have in retaining the social support and the integrity of the market. So that's additionality. Another fundamental principle is around no double counting. And this is just naturally, if you're getting a credit in one place, it's very similar to additionality. You can't get credit for the same action under a different system. And so there are some sort of subtle changes that, or subtle differences, where there are some markets, such as the low carbon fuel standards that we talked about, that are almost intended to be stackable so that people can slice and dice the environmental consequences of a project and get different benefits. But in general, no double counting is the rule. This is the really important one. And this is one where, as an early stage company, you need to pay attention, because it may well be that you take a benefit early, let's say a tax credit, or some kind of early incentive funding that is related to the attributes of your technology, which then may cause questions to arise later for a purchaser as to whether you're double counting the attributes, whether those attributes are really yours to sell. So that's an important one to bear in mind. The final point is this concept of environmental attributes, which is really a way of describing all of the effects that you're having on the environment, and trying to bundle all of those together into a contract in order to be able to purchase and sell those environmental attributes, to turn these things into a tradable commodity. Because it's not like a land transaction where we have 400 years of common law developing as to what's an interest in land. These environmental attributes don't exist. They're not recognized at law. So we have to create them out of contractual commitments around agreements not to report GHG emission savings, or not to seek to get credit under a different system. So this notion of environmental attributes is a core to various agreements that get constructed around environmental markets. And a lot of work has gone in from AIDA, amongst others, to really develop the concept. And there is a rich sort of history of law around what ought to be recognized as an environmental attribute. You could just advance the slide there, Stephen. So I'm going to now speed up. Those were the background. I want to speed up a little bit to leave lots of times for questions. But I wanted to talk about some of the legal issues that arise when you, at the project level, where either you might be involved in developing the project that would get approved under the kinds of protocols that Simon has been talking about, or a technology that's being developed would then get used in a project and would get a benefit. So the fundamental features of carbon projects that you have to remember from a legal perspective is there's higher than normal regulatory risk. When I'm talking about regulatory risk, I'm talking about regulations changing. That's one important aspect, and that does obviously happen quite a bit in the carbon markets, makes it a little challenging. And I'm also talking about regulatory diversity. We've already had the beautifully colored maps where we saw all the different regimes. And it's very important to understand that when you're getting a low carbon technology or a project approved in one, you're always going to be facing questions of whether a future regime or a different regime might be more attractive. So making your contracts bulletproof, both for regulatory changes and also if your counterparty wants to take your project and use it in a different system, it's very important. Second thing to comment on is counterparty risk. I find that part of the challenge of being a lawyer in this space is there's a lot of diversity of large and small clients, sophisticated and unsophisticated, entrepreneurs who are seeing this as a business transaction, and entrepreneurs who are really seeing themselves as social entrepreneurs who are trying to create a difference in the world. Creates a lot of difference on the counterparty risk. So there's both the normal sort of credit risk that arises, and also just how do you communicate your requirements as a sophisticated business partner when the other side might have a little less sophisticated view of the world. So that can be quite challenging. And then the other thing that makes project development challenging is legal uncertainty. I've already alluded to this in the sense that offsets don't, like, once they're issued, so once you get to the end of the project development process that Simon sketched out, and either in a voluntary system or a compliance system, there is an issuance of a unit, then that is something that is fairly certain. But there's a lot of uncertainty around what is actually the environmental attributes, how you can enforce those in the future. And one big thing to bear in mind is that there isn't a way of taking security in the environmental attributes of a project. So there are lots of tools that you would normally have in a project development context that are just unavailable as a lawyer in this sector, which can make it challenging. If we can just advance the slide. And so I sort of wanted to summarize some strategic issues that everyone should think about. First of all, we've already talked about it, but from a legal perspective, this is very important, delineating the environmental attributes. So not understanding them in a vague way, and in addition to quantifying them in the way that Simon talked about, but also being able to describe them in a clear way that is appropriate for a legal contract. So that's a really important thing to think about at an early stage. Second question is, where does the technology sit in the value chain? Very important in terms of the legal questions that arise would be who owns the physical plant. We talked about ownership before, where, for example, if you're collecting methane that's off gas from a played out coal mine, and then you're burning it to get a better outcome from the environment's perspective, who owns the benefits? Is it the landowner? Is it the coal miner who may still have the subsurface rights to the coal? Or is it the entrepreneur who's gone in and spent the money to put the pipes in, cap the mine, and flare the methane to make it less impactful from an environmental perspective? So that's where ownership actually comes up at a practical level, and just understanding who owns what, very, very important. Third point, what would it take to monetize the attributes? And the final point, just to close out and give us lots of time, is who's best placed to do this? Because one of the things I think people don't ask enough is, well, our technology may be very, very important for environmental markets. Someone can monetize this, but maybe it's our purchasers, it's not us, in which case, what can we do now to build in real-time monitoring or other aspects of our technology, which then makes it easier for end users to achieve monetization? So all sorts of questions, and I think that's my last slide, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. If anyone has any questions, or particulars, then please don't hesitate to give me a call.
Thank you, Kai. And as you saw on that last slide was that contact information, and hopefully phone might be ringing off the hook after this. I guess what I wanted to say was some of those really did dive quickly and went through a lot of information very, very fast. My takeaway would be there are really smart, capable people, some of them on this call, who are working in these markets and can help you. And I guess my analogy would be, it's much like intellectual property. It can be very valuable to your company, and you should reach out to experts in the field to get their opinion on it. I'd like to say thank you for the people on this call as well, from Katie representing, trying to bring about those international treaties and agreements and making a marketplace that will allow that trading to go on. I don't know if she really hit on it as much as I've had in some other conversations with her, where Canada won't be able to meet our commitments without international trading of carbon offsets. So your wonderful technologies need to be installed in other countries, and we need to buy those credits back to kind of offset what we're doing so we can meet our national commitments and hit our policies. And to Kai and Simon, who've been working in this space for a while, I think you said now the space is kind of steadied and there's a long track record of ways of doing things. There's an established mode of operating to get projects through, to get legal contracts through, and there's a lot less risk. And I think you guys have been operating it since the day where there was a lot less clarity and there was a lot more risk. So, thank you for your investment in the time and space. And I also want to say that it's a very exciting space. I don't know if that kind of came out in the billions of dollars being committed to this. In the voluntary markets, I think recently Amazon said that they were going to commit a couple $1 billion. I know Stripe had committed $1 billion a few months ago. So this is a market that's going to have a very big value on that voluntary side. Simon did kind of call out the size of that voluntary market. And all of those numbers, those $30 a ton, the $40 a ton that Katie threw up there, that is the compliance market numbers. And Simon alluded to there are some other larger opportunities in order of magnitudes. That low carbon fuel standard is, I think, in BC trading between 100 last months that they report for. So, there is a lot of interest in the space, and it's a very exciting space that's rapidly changing. We do have some questions, so I'm actually going to go in kind of reverse order. Vic asked, what's the first step to determine feasibility on a project? And who would you speak to about that? Who would like to field that?
Sure. I mean, the first step, really is you could pick up the phone and call me. How's that for a so? Yeah, really what you want to do is, I'm always an advocate for undertaking, some form of benefits assessment. So you really want to understand, through your internal, resources, try and delineate what you think your benefits are. Now, understanding baseline is obviously inherent in that process, and sometimes there is nuance there. But yeah, it's really, if you have very limited knowledge in the space, it's probably picking up the phone and contacting, somebody who can advise in the space. And, we get lots of calls from people who have very limited knowledge. And it's a quick conversation. Sometimes it's, 5 minutes, and you very quickly, as the potential project proponent, realize, maybe there's a number of reasons why right now we're not ready, but there is potential, or, there isn't something here. Or oftentimes it's like, okay, there's a wealth of potential steps to take. And, the first thing is looking at, often, what are the price dynamics involved? So, I guess short answer is, if you feel overwhelmed, reach out to somebody who's involved in the space to get kind of the ball rolling on what one might have to do to really get better insight as to how to crack this nut, essentially.
And just really quickly, maybe for a kind of a back of the envelope look at things, you sort of talk about protocol development. If there isn't a protocol in place, you mentioned it was about a year. Obviously, you need to pull in some people to do that. You'd mentioned some of the skilled technical skilled people that you would need to accomplish that. Swings and roundabouts, I mean, what does that cost if there's not a protocol in place to quickly sort of say?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a pretty, let's say if if in the system that one is eligible to pursue, there's not a protocol, but there is in another system, then that is a much easier process than creating something from scratch. So, for example, and some systems like BCS will allow protocols from other systems. So the clean development mechanism under Kyoto has the biggest registry of methodologies. There's hundreds of them. So if one is pursuing a voluntary project and there is for your project activity a CDM methodology that covers much of what your activity is doing, but there's some things to address through a revision, then the costs and resources associated with doing that would be potentially much less. You could be looking at going from doing the assessment of that protocol to drafting a revised version of that under the new system, offset system. Let's say it's a VCS, to getting that reviewed. You could be looking at 6 months. It really depends. And then costs associated with that. It could be a pretty streamlined process. So you could be looking at between 50 and 100K. But when you're getting into creating a new protocol, or a protocol that's in a compliance jurisdiction, which has a much more working group type modus operandi, then you're looking at years probably, and probably a shared resource consortium approach, really. So I mean, hopefully that provides a bit of an insight. It's hard to really pinpoint, it's this and this system, it's this and this system. It really depends on the context and the details. But